This was a few years ago. I've been inspecting track for a class I railroad through the Cascades for over 2 decades. I run a high rail truck solo on graveyard shifts. One night, half a mile inside an 11-mile bore tunnel, my headlights hit a man standing between the rails, hand raised. There's no way to walk into that tunnel. Both portals are gated, alarmed, and miles apart through solid rock. I stopped, and I still don't know what I saw. That was Michael. He spent 23 years inspecting rail alone through the most remote mountain passes in the Pacific Northwest. The job is simple: drive a truck on the tracks, check for defects, and report anything wrong. But what Michael saw that night wasn't a rockfall or a broken rail. It was a person where no person could possibly be. And the thing that turns this from a campfire tale into something deeply unsettling is this: the railroad knows about it. They've known for decades, and they've been keeping a file. Michael would see that same figure 11 more times over the next 4 years. Each time in the exact same 400-foot stretch of tunnel. And each time something terrible was about to happen. The tunnel is officially called the Cascade Bore. Unofficially, the crews just call it the Long Dark. 11.2 miles of solid rock, carved in 1929 through the kind of granite that laughs at a jackhammer. In 23 years, I've driven every inch of it more times than I can count. I know every crack in the lining, every patch of damp on the walls, every spot where the rail kinks just slightly because the mountain is still settling a century later. It's a cathedral of darkness, and most nights, I'm the only person in it. My job is simple. I drive a customized Ford F-350 that's been fitted with steel wheels that ride the rails. It's called a high rail truck. I creep through the tunnel at about 5 miles an hour, and I stare at the track, the ballast, the overhead wires, looking for anything that might derail a freight train carrying 3 million pounds of cargo. A broken rail, a loose bolt, a fallen rock. I do this alone, always have. The railroad runs 3 shifts through here, and I work the graveyard 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., deepest dark, coldest hours. Nobody checks on you. Nobody talks to you. Just the hum of the engine and the hiss of the radio, which barely works once you're more than half a mile inside because the mountain swallows everything. The tunnel is secured at both ends. The west portal and east portal are each gated, topped with razor wire and wired with motion sensors and alarms. You can't walk into this tunnel. There are no side adits, no ventilation shafts, no service doors anywhere along that 11-mile stretch. It's just a tube through the earth with 2 ends. I've inspected every foot of it, I know that for a fact. And yet on a night in late November, that fact crumbled. I was about 5,000 feet in. The headlights cut a narrow slice through the black, the walls rushing past on both sides, the rails gleaming. My mind was on autopilot. You learn to let your eyes do the work while your brain drifts. It's the only way to stay sane. And then I saw him. A man standing between the rails, facing me, one hand raised like he was signaling me to stop. He wasn't wearing any reflective gear. He wasn't a rail worker. He was just there, half a mile inside a tunnel with no entrances. I hit the brakes. The truck shuddered to a halt, the headlights fixed on this impossible figure. My heart didn't race, not yet. I was too confused. I blinked. He was still there. His face was shadowed, but I could see the shape of him, solid and still, arm up. I grabbed the radio, keyed the mic, and told dispatch I was stopping for a track inspection. I didn't say why. I didn't have words. I stepped out of the truck. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and diesel. I grabbed my lantern and walked forward. My boots crunched on the ballast. The beam of my flashlight swept the walls, the ceiling, the track, and then the spot where the man had been standing. He was gone. There was nothing. No side tunnels, no crevices, no place to hide. Just the endless straight line of the rails vanishing into the black. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, sweeping every inch of that 400-foot section. I checked the walls for any maintenance alcoves I might have forgotten. I checked the drainage culvert at the base of the wall, which is only 6 inches wide. Nothing. I walked back to the truck, got in, and completed my run. I told myself it was a trick of the light, exhaustion, a waking dream. I'd been on shift for 6 hours. I hadn't slept well. It was an explanation. But here's the thing about explanations. They need to hold up the second time, and the third. 4 weeks later, I saw him again. Same stretch of track, same posture, hand raised. This time I didn't stop. I just kept driving, my knuckles white on the wheel, my eyes locked on the spot until the headlights pushed past it and he was gone. I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I told no one. Over the next 4 years, I saw that figure 11 more times. Always in the same 400-foot stretch, roughly 5,800 feet in from the west portal, always facing me, always with the hand raised. I started to dread that section. You have to understand, when you're alone in the dark for hours at a time, your mind can start to play games. But this wasn't a flicker in my peripheral vision. This was a man as clear as a stop sign appearing where no man could be. And each time something happened. Not immediately, but within the next shift or two. A broken rail exactly where he'd stood, a rock on the track. Once a section of overhead wire snapped and fell. Every time I would have passed through that same spot at speed if I hadn't been warned. The railroad has a protocol for unexplained incidents. It's called report and disregard. You tell your supervisor, they note it in a log, and you're encouraged to get more rest, check your carbon monoxide levels in the truck, maybe take a few days off. So I kept quiet. Until one night, the warning came not for a broken rail, but for a mountain that was about to come down. I was rolling through that cursed section when the figure appeared again, hand raised, more urgent somehow. I slammed the brakes instinctively, and 90 seconds later, a slab of granite the size of a refrigerator sheared off the tunnel ceiling and crashed onto the rails 20 feet in front of my truck. I would have been directly under it. I sat there in the silent dark, engine idling, staring at the rubble, and I made a decision. I was going to file a formal report, not to the shift supervisor who'd call me crazy, but to the railroad's claims and safety department in Omaha. I was going to tell them everything. The figure, the pattern, the near miss that nearly flattened me. I didn't know it yet, but that decision would open a door that had been closed for over 50 years. And what was waiting behind it was so much stranger than a ghost in a tunnel. I filed the report on a Monday. It was 12 pages, single-spaced, everything I'd seen, every date, every near miss, every cold rush of dread that had crawled up my spine during those 4 years. I faxed it to the claims and safety office in Omaha with no expectation of what would happen next. I assumed they'd call me in for a psych evaluation or quietly transfer me to a desk job. Instead, silence. For 2 weeks, nothing. Then, on a Wednesday morning, I got a FedEx envelope with no return address, just the railroad's logo embossed in the corner. Inside was a letter, a non-disclosure agreement, and a manila folder that was easily 40 years old. The letter was from a senior claims adjuster named Margaret Delacroix. It was cordial, almost too polite. It thanked me for my detailed report and expressed relief that I had not been injured in the recent rockfall incident. It then explained that the enclosed folder contained historical documentation relevant to the section of tunnel in question. The documentation was being provided, it said, so that I might understand the full context of my experiences and recognize them for what the railroad's occupational health division had long since categorized: fatigue-induced visual phenomena, exacerbated by the monotony and sensory deprivation of tunnel work. The letter then invited me to review the file, sign the attached NDA, and accept a settlement offer of 6 months' pay in exchange for my cooperation and discretion. I read that paragraph 3 times, fatigue-induced. They had a whole category for it, which meant I wasn't the first. I opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a typed memo dated October 23, 1968. It was from a regional safety director to the vice president of operations. The subject line read, "Unusual Incident Reports, Cascade Bore, Section Marker 42. The memo stated that over the previous 10 months, 3 track inspectors had independently reported seeing a male figure standing on the track inside the tunnel, always in the same 400-foot section, always raising a hand in a stop signal. In each case, the inspector had made an emergency stop, and in each case, a significant track defect or obstruction was subsequently discovered within that same section." The memo concluded with a recommendation. "We are classifying these as probable fatigue hallucinations, but given the statistical improbability of 3 separate incidents aligning with track defects, Operations should consider a directive requiring radio check-ins for all solo runs through the bore. That recommendation was stamped approved in red ink. The directive was issued in early 1969, but then I turned the page and I saw it had been quietly rescinded just 16 months later. Budget reasons, a handwritten note said. Too much radio traffic. The decision was made to return to solo runs. And that's when the file got thicker. The next pages were individual incident reports, each one filed by a different inspector over the decades. There were 7 in total, not counting mine. The first was a man named Clarence Brewer, November 14, 1968. He saw the figure and stopped. 3 hours later, a freight crew found a 12-foot section of rail cracked clean through at that exact spot. The second was Howard Tilson, March 3, 1972. He saw the figure, stopped, and radioed it in. The dispatcher told him to proceed with caution. 10 minutes later, he rounded a bend and found the tunnel partially blocked by a rock slide that had punched through the lining. The third was Raymond Sutter, January 9, 1979. Same figure, same spot. He stopped. That night, a flash flood washed out 50 yards of ballast 200 feet ahead. He would have derailed at 40 miles an hour. And then there was a page for a man who didn't get to file his own report. His name was Walter Keshian. He was 29 years old, married, 2 kids. On December 2, 1971, he was running the Cascade bore solo. He radioed dispatch at approximately 2:47 a.m. The transcript of that call was in the file. He said, and I quote, "I've got a man on the track just past marker 42. He's waving me down. I'm stopping." The dispatcher asked if he was certain. Walter said yes. The dispatcher told him to proceed and report any obstruction. Walter acknowledged. That was the last transmission. His truck was found the next morning, crushed under a 12-ton slab of granite that had sheared off the tunnel ceiling. The official investigation concluded the rockfall was an unforeseeable geological event. The internal report in my folder said something different. It said, Inspector Keshian's reported visual anomaly may have resulted in a momentary lapse of attention that placed his vehicle in the path of falling debris. Contributing fatigue likely a factor. Fatigue killed Walter Keshian, not the mountain, not the 1,000 pounds of rock that flattened his cab. Fatigue. I felt sick, because I knew what that report was doing. It was building a wall of language, a fortress of liability protection. If the railroad acknowledged that these sightings were warnings, real warnings that prevented accidents, they would be admitting that they had sent a man to his death by ignoring one. So they called it fatigue. They called it hallucinations. They put it in a folder and locked it away. And then, after Walter Keshian died, something very strange happened. The railroad didn't reinstate the radio check directive from 1969. They went further. They implemented a new, unwritten policy. No solo inspector would ever run that tunnel without a second radio check every 15 minutes. If the inspector didn't respond, a rescue crew was dispatched immediately. That policy was never published in any manual. It was passed down by word of mouth from one shift supervisor to the next. It's still in place today. I know because I've been on the receiving end of those check-ins for 2 decades and I never knew why they started. The file held one more detail. As I sat there, the folder open on my kitchen table, I started flipping back through the reports, looking at the dates. Clarence Brewer, November 14, 1968. Howard Tilson, March 3, 1972. Raymond Sutter, January 9, 1979. Walter Keshian, December 2, 1971. And then the others, August 28, 1984, February 11, 1993, September 5, 2001, and my own November 19, 2009. At first, the dates looked scattered, random. But then I pulled out a calendar and started marking them, year by year, month by month. And that's when the air in the room went cold. Every single sighting, every single near miss, every single tragedy had occurred within a 7-day window of the same date. A date that wasn't in the file. A date I had to look up myself. The Wellington Avalanche of 1910, the deadliest rail disaster in American history, happened on March 1st. And every ghostly warning in that tunnel had come within days of its anniversary. I couldn't sleep for the next 3 days. The file sat on my table and I kept going back to it, tracing the names, the dates, the same cold conclusion staring back at me. A pattern that stretched across 4 decades, through 7 different men, all seeing the same impossible figure in the same impossible place. And every single time within days the mountain moved. I started to ask myself a question that felt too crazy to speak out loud. What if this wasn't just a warning system? What if it was a man? The official history of the Cascade Bore begins in 1925, 3 years before construction started, 15 years after the Wellington avalanche that killed 96 people. That disaster happened on a different line, the old Great Northern route over Stevens Pass, where trains had to climb a brutal series of switchbacks through the kind of snow that could bury a locomotive in an hour. On the last day of February 1910, 2 trains were trapped at the Wellington Depot by a blizzard that dropped 11 feet of snow in a single day. Just after 1 in the morning on March 1st, a slab of snow and ice the size of a city block broke loose from the mountain and swept both trains 300 feet into a ravine. 96 bodies were pulled from the wreckage. Some of them were never found. The disaster was so catastrophic that the Great Northern spent the next 15 years mapping a new route, one that would bore straight through the mountain, bypassing the avalanche zone entirely. The Cascade Bore was born from that tragedy, a monument to the dead, a pledge that it would never happen again. I started digging into the specific section of tunnel where the sightings always occurred. Mile marker 5.8, near the old ventilation shaft that was sealed in 1962. I pulled the construction records from the county archives. The tunnel was built from both ends simultaneously, 2 crews drilling toward each other through solid rock. On October 17, 1928, the west crew hit a void, a natural cavern filled with unstable rock and water. 3 men were killed instantly when the ceiling collapsed: a foreman named Joseph Bellamy, a powder monkey named Emmett Carson, and a laborer named Thomas Malley. Their bodies were recovered, but the cave-in was so severe that the engineers decided to reroute the tunnel slightly to the north, bypassing the void entirely. The section where they died was sealed and never touched again. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. The rerouted tunnel, the one I drove through every night, passed directly beneath that sealed cavern. The exact spot where those 3 men died was 60 feet above the rails, encased in concrete and forgotten. And that spot, according to the survey coordinates, lined up perfectly with section marker 42, the 400-foot stretch where the figure always appeared. I called Margaret Delacroix, the claims adjuster who'd sent the file. I expected her to deflect, to hide behind procedure, but she surprised me. Her voice on the phone was tired, a woman who'd been carrying something for a long time. She told me she'd been assigned to the Cascade Bore file in 1991 when she was a junior adjuster, and that it had been passed down from her predecessor, a man named Harold Vance, who retired after 38 years. She said Harold told her once, off the record, that the file wasn't complete. There were earlier reports from before 1968 that had been removed and destroyed by the railroad's legal department in the late 1950s. Reports from construction workers, maintenance crews, even a fireman on a steam locomotive who swore he saw a man waving a lantern from inside the tunnel wall. Those reports, Harold said, went back to 1931, just 3 years after the collapse that killed Bellamy, Carson, and Mao. The railroad didn't want a ghost story attached to their billion-dollar engineering marvel, so they erased it. But they couldn't erase everything. Margaret told me something else, something that explained why she'd sent me the file in the first place, against what she called better judgment and explicit policy. She said that 3 weeks before my rockfall near miss, a seismic monitoring station buried in the mountain above the tunnel had recorded microtremors consistent with an impending collapse in the exact section where the void had been. The data suggested a major failure was building, something that could wipe out 100 feet of tunnel lining and kill anyone inside. The railroad's engineers were aware of it, but they'd classified the risk as long-term, manageable, and scheduled repairs for the following summer. They hadn't told the inspection crews. They hadn't told anyone at my level. Margaret said she'd been wondering for 20 years if the figure in the tunnel was trying to save lives that the railroad was willing to gamble with. And then my report landed on her desk and she decided to break the silence. I asked her one last question: who was the first inspector to ever see the figure, the one whose report was destroyed in the 1950s? Margaret went quiet for a long moment. Then she said a name I didn't recognize. Not Bellamy, Carson, or Malley, a fourth name. A track walker named Francis Keating. He'd worked the graveyard shift just like me. In March of 1931, he radioed dispatch from inside the tunnel, saying he'd seen a man standing on the track, hand raised, wearing an old-style railroad coat. He stopped, got out, and the man was gone. There was no defect on the track, so he kept going. The next night he passed through the same section and the tunnel roof collapsed behind him. He made it out, but barely. After that, he quit. He moved to Montana and never worked for a railroad again. But before he left, he told one person what he'd seen, a dispatcher who wrote it down in a personal notebook that somehow made it into Harold Vance's hands decades later. Francis Keating said the figure's coat had a name stitched on the breast pocket. He couldn't read it clearly, but he was sure it started with a B. Bellamy. The foreman who died in 1928, his body buried in concrete, his death erased from the official narrative. I looked at the photograph of Joseph Bellamy that I found in the Historical Society archive, a sepia-toned portrait of a man in his 40s, with a weathered face, a thick mustache, and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. I stared at that photograph for an hour, trying to match it to the figure I'd seen in my headlights, and I couldn't be sure. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water, that the hand raised on that track was not just a warning about falling rock or broken rail. It was a warning about the railroad itself, and what it was willing to bury to protect its bottom line. I made another call, this time to a journalist I knew from a union meeting years ago, a man named Dale who covered occupational safety in the rail industry. I told him enough to get his attention, and he started doing his own digging. 2 weeks later, he sent me a document that he'd gotten through a Freedom of Information request to the Federal Railroad Administration. It was a summary of employee-reported unusual occurrences in the Cascade Bore, compiled by the railroad and submitted annually. The FRA had been receiving these reports for decades, and they'd never acted on them. The file showed that since 1968, there had been 31 emergency stops reported in that section, far more than any other stretch of tunnel in the entire system. 24 of those stops were attributed to fatigue-induced visual phenomena. But here's what the railroad had done. Every single time, they'd also quietly logged a secondary inspection of the track in the hours or days after, and 22 of those secondary inspections had found a defect, a rock fall, a washout, or a structural failure that could have caused a derailment. The correlation was near perfect. The railroad's own data proved that the hallucinations were accurate warnings. And they'd been hiding that data, labeling it as psychiatric incidents, while quietly benefiting from the lives saved. And now, I understood the real purpose of the non-disclosure agreement in my hands. It wasn't just to keep me quiet about a ghost story. It was to keep me quiet about a systematic, decades-long cover-up of safety hazards that had killed at least one man, Walter Keshian, and could have killed dozens more. The railroad had built a legal wall around that tunnel, paying off inspectors, burying reports, classifying genuine workplace hazards as mental illness, all to avoid the cost of real repairs and the liability of admitting they'd known about the danger all along. The figure in the tunnel wasn't the threat. The railroad was, and the next anniversary of the Wellington avalanche was only 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. I didn't sign the NDA. I couldn't. Every night I climbed into that high-rail truck, and every night I passed marker 42, my headlights cutting nothing but empty tunnel, I felt the weight of the choice I was about to make. Margaret Delacroix had warned me gently that if I pushed this, the railroad would stop being polite. They'd bury me in litigation, drag my name through every psychological review board they could convene, and paint me as an unhinged employee with an axe to grind. They'd done it before. She'd seen it happen to at least two other men whose names weren't even in the file anymore. They make you the story, she said, so no one looks at the mountain. But that's the thing about mountains. They don't care about stories. They just move when they're ready. Dale, the journalist, had found something else in the FRA documents. The seismic data that Margaret mentioned wasn't just a warning, it was a countdown. The microtremors were accelerating, not linearly but exponentially, the kind of curve that geologists call a failure cascade. The sealed void above marker 42, the one where Bellamy and the others died, had been slowly filling with groundwater for nearly a century. Water expands when it freezes. Every winter, the ice pushed a little harder against the fractured ceiling. Every thaw, the cracks widened a fraction of an inch. The engineers' own models showed that the next major freeze-thaw cycle, peaking right around the first week of March, could trigger a catastrophic collapse of the entire sealed cavern and the tunnel below it. Not a rockfall the size of a refrigerator. A collapse that would bury 200 feet of track under 1,000 tons of granite. The scheduled repairs for next summer would, mathematically, be at least 3 months too late. I told Dale to run the story. He did. It broke on a Tuesday morning front page of the Seattle Times with a headline that read, "The Ghost in the Machine, Railroad Knew of Cascade Tunnel Danger for Decades, Did Nothing." The article named names: Bellamy, Keshian, the 7 inspectors, the missing reports. It included quotes from Margaret Delacroix, who decided to retire rather than be complicit any longer. It published segments of the seismic data, leaked by an engineer who'd had enough. It asked a simple question. If your employee tells you a ghost is saving lives in your tunnel, and every data point says they're telling the truth, who is really haunting that mountain? The response was immediate and furious. The railroad's public relations department called it irresponsible sensationalism. Their lawyers called it defamation. But within 48 hours, the Federal Railroad Administration announced an emergency suspension of all solo operations in the Cascade Bore and ordered an immediate, independent geological survey. The Union, which had been quietly aware of the ghost file for years but lacked the evidence to act, filed a formal grievance demanding the release of every internal safety report dating back to 1928. The railroad was cornered. On February 27th, 2 days before the anniversary, they closed the tunnel entirely and dispatched an emergency repair crew with heavy equipment and a mandate to stabilize that void. I was there that night, parked at the west portal, watching the construction lights flicker inside the tunnel mouth like fireflies in a tomb. A crew supervisor I knew, a man named Pete, walked over to my truck and asked if I wanted to go in with them. He knew about the sightings. The whole division knew now. I said no. I'd had enough of that dark, but I told him to watch for anything unusual, anything at all, and to radio me if they found something. 3 hours later, my radio crackled. It was Pete. His voice was strange, quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Mike," he said, "you're going to want to see this." They drilled up into the sealed cavern, the one that had been closed since 1928. The plan was to inject concrete to stabilize the ceiling, but when they got a camera up there, it showed something no one expected. The void wasn't just a natural cave. It was a half-finished tunnel, the original route that had been abandoned after the collapse. The rails were still there, rusted to ribbons, buried in rubble. And against the far wall, half encased in the very flowstone that had been dripping down for a century, were 3 wooden crosses. Rough things, lashed together with old telegraph wire, planted in a crack in the floor. Someone had buried those men properly down there in the dark, nearly 100 years ago, and no one had ever known. When the crew hauled up the first bucket of debris, it contained a scrap of wool cloth, almost petrified, with 3 letters still faintly visible: Bell. The rest was gone, worn away by time and water, but it was enough. It was Joseph Bellamy's coat. The tunnel was stabilized by March 2nd. No collapse, no disaster. The anniversary passed and the mountain stayed quiet. I went back to work the following week, a new directive in place. 2-man crews for the Cascade Bore, radio checks every 10 minutes, and a seismic monitoring station with a live feed to the dispatcher's desk. The railroad never admitted fault publicly. They settled with Walter Keshian's widow, decades too late, for an undisclosed sum. They quietly promoted Margaret Delacroix's replacement and issued a memo clarifying the proper procedures for reporting unusual visual phenomena. Fatigue was still their preferred explanation, but they didn't remove the file. They didn't destroy the folder that now included my report, number 8, and the newspaper article and the FRA order. They just added a new cover page that read in red ink, "Do not destroy. Historical." I found that out from Margaret, who still had friends in that office. She said it was the first time that file had ever been marked for preservation instead of disposal. Maybe the railroad had learned something. Or maybe they just realized that some truths are stubborn, that they refuse to be buried under concrete and legal language, and that a hand raised in warning, century after century, will eventually be seen. I still run that tunnel. I still pass marker 42 on every shift. The figure hasn't appeared since the repairs, not to me, not to anyone. Part of me wonders if Bellamy, if that's who it was, could finally rest, knowing the danger was addressed. Part of me suspects he was never resting at all, just doing what no living person would, standing in the path of disaster and raising his hand until someone listened. But here's the detail that has never left me. The thing I think about at 3 a.m. when the tunnel is silent and the radio hisses with static. 3 crosses in the cavern tied with telegraph wire. Who put them there? Bellamy and the others died instantly. The crew evacuated. That section was sealed within days. The crosses shouldn't exist. Someone went back, risked the unstable ceiling, crawled into the dark and marked those graves. A track walker, a friend, a stranger. Whoever they were, they left no record. Just 3 pieces of wood and a prayer. And a hand, maybe, that never stopped waving. I never signed the non-disclosure agreement. It still sits in my desk drawer, yellowing under a coffee mug, the signature line blank. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd signed it and taken the money, let the story stay buried. The tunnel would have collapsed on some graveyard shift, maybe the very next winter, and another inspector would have met the mountain alone. His name would have been added to a folder marked historical, and the railroad would have called it fatigue again. That's the quiet violence of institutions. They don't need to bury you. They just need you to stay silent long enough for the rock to do the rest. But the silence broke. And when it did, something shifted, not just in that tunnel, but in 100 break rooms and dispatcher offices across the system. After the story ran, I started getting letters. Track walkers in Montana, signal maintainers in the Sierras, high rail operators in the Rockies, all of them with their own stories. A woman running a crossing gate in Nebraska, who saw a conductor in a uniform that hadn't been issued since the 40s, standing in her headlights, pointing toward a broken switch. A Gandhi dancer in Colorado whose crew stopped work because an old man warned them of a loose rail, then vanished into a hillside with no footprints. A dispatcher in northern Idaho who received a radio call from a train number that had been retired after a fatal wreck in 1957. I'm not saying every flicker of shadow on a night shift is a ghost reaching out from the beyond. I've spent too many hours in the dark to be that certain about anything. But I am saying this. The men and women who keep the rails running, who do the invisible work in the loneliest places on Earth, they know something the safety manuals don't teach. They know that sometimes the warning comes from somewhere you can't explain, and the only thing that matters is whether you have the courage to listen. The figure at marker 42 hasn't been seen since the repairs. Maybe Bellamy's work is done. Or maybe it was never about Bellamy at all. Maybe it was just the mountain itself finding a way to speak, using the shape of a man because that's the only language we understand. I don't know. I don't think I'll ever know. But I do know that there are 3 wooden crosses in a sealed cavern a mile inside a mountain, placed by hands that history forgot, and they're still standing. If you find yourself in a tunnel someday alone, and you see a hand raised in the dark, don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it. Just stop. Because the next thing to come down that tunnel might weigh 1,000 tons, and the only person standing between you and it might be someone who's already given everything they had. If you've ever worked a job where the rules don't explain what you've seen, or if you've had your own close call that logic couldn't account for, share your story in the comments. I read them. We all do, And if you want more stories from the edge of the map, stories that don't make it into the official reports, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The mountain is still listening, and so are we.